we might just start again then.
Sorry, everyone.
Okay. So we are I'll just briefly skim through. So we're a law firm based in Brisbane, but we do advices all over Australia. Technically, we're on the outskirts of Brisbane, and I am absolutely delighted to be presenting this in conjunction with my colleague Eustacia. Eustacia is probably better known to some of you through her work at Malyon, but she has joined our team and presently heads up the family law team. Between the two of us, we've done family law for a really long time. We've both got some degrees, we've both got some experience, and then we've heard most of it and not much shock society anymore. Eustacia also has a graduate diploma in divinity, which gives her some theological edge over me. However, we'll get into it. So, the usual exclusions: I'm just a lawyer, I'm not a pastor, and I don't have any theological training. And today I'd like to give you some information and pose a whole lot of questions. So today I'm hoping this will be the start of a series of discussions that you have with your team about how to improve ministry to people that have experienced or are experiencing family and domestic violence, and also the perpetrators. In terms of some scenarios, all names, locations and denominations have been changed to protect the innocent. But all of the scenarios I give today are real-life ones that I've dealt with over the course of my career. So, a couple of scenarios. First one, a member of the congregation discloses that they've been the victim of domestic violence during ongoing counselling. And where to from here? The second one is a member of the congregation comes to you and they say that they don't have contact with their wife or their children, and they're not allowed to contact them because of a domestic violence order, but they want to take steps to open dialogue and reconcile with the wife. This particular matter has long been dear to my heart because it was the very first time I became aware of how poorly some churches dealt with domestic violence. This was a situation where the husband had been in jail for offences against the family. He'd gotten out of jail. He had a God experience in jail and was convinced that God was going to reconcile him with his wife. In this particular matter, there was a specific order that said that the husband was not allowed to make contact with the wife or the children directly or indirectly. He forgot to disclose that, I suspect, to the pastor. I would hope that the pastor, had he seen that order, would not have made contact. But he made contact with our client by phone on several occasions, leaving messages. And I think it would not be unfair to say that that particular scenario was devastating to that woman, because she had just started to get on her own feet, and all of a sudden she was being contacted by a pastor that she didn't know, who was seeking to act as an intermediary in circumstances where the very act of doing that was assisting someone to breach a domestic violence order. The third one is a situation that was a bit more recent. It's still not particularly recent, but a member of the congregation came to the pastor and said that they'd decided to separate from their spouse. They disclosed that they had engaged a lawyer and were seeking a domestic violence order against their spouse. I happen to be the lucky lawyer, or unlucky as the case may be. The husband in that particular case was saying that he was sorry that he wouldn't do it again. And in the end, the pastor started doing joint counselling sessions with them. The joint counselling sessions included some remorse at the time, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the other thing to say is that the pastor recommended that the proceedings be ceased because, of course, Christians having lawyers and going to court against each other is not ideal. And the pastor also recommended that the domestic violence order be withdrawn because, after all, they couldn't very well reconcile as husband and wife with that in place. that happened. Further domestic violence occurred. It was a fairly short period later that the wife separated again from the husband. And on the way home from church, she had started worshipping elsewhere. On the way home, the husband had figured out where she was worshipping and didn't know where she lived, but decided to follow her home. And in so doing, at one point in time, crossed onto the wrong side of the road, mounted the curb and attempted to run her over. Perhaps not surprisingly, after she moved away from him, she again sought another domestic violence order. The final one is not a legal one. It was an interaction that I had, and in fact a number of people had in the church family, because a couple of people came to me and said, I'm concerned about this, something doesn't feel right. No one knew quite what was happening until quite late one night when one of the parties in the relationship turned up at my house and disclosed some particularly controlling behaviours. So those are the 4 that we're going to probably be revisiting later, but I want you to start thinking about them, because those are things that happen all the time. It's not uncommon for people to disclose to a pastor or a member of the pastoral team that they've been the victim of domestic violence. It's not uncommon for people to want to reconcile in these circumstances. It's not uncommon for people to have to wrestle with the dilemma of what to do about whether to stay in a court process or not when you're a Christian, and what to do about whether or not they stay in a marriage or not. That's a very personal decision, and a lot of people have got a lot of views and ideas about that. I'd encourage you to be cautious about allowing people to ventilate those views. I'm very happily married and have been for many, many years, and yet I can also tell you that over the past 14 years of my career, many churches and many people in churches have come to me and remonstrated with me at length about my involvement in the court process in, as they see it, splitting up families. It's a tough place to be, and I would urge caution when you deal with these sorts of scenarios within your church. So I want to talk about the word pictures we use. So as Christians, we often use pictures and stories to communicate what we want to communicate. And that's absolutely, we take that from the best example we have, which is Jesus, who told lots of stories. But communication is not just what we tell someone, it's a process. Good communication is about sending that message and ensuring the message we intend to communicate is received by the person we're communicating with in the way we expected. It's one of the reasons why one of the mediation techniques that we use is, well, what do you think I just said? Could you tell it to me in your words what you think I was just talking about? It's about getting that feedback loop and making sure that it's as we intended to communicate. The problem is that we have is that people who have lived in families of origin who will have a vastly different background often will find that those backgrounds and experiences will impact heavily upon the perceptions that they have when we use those word pictures. So 2 examples. I had a girlfriend of mine who was the duty lawyer for a juvenile justice court. That particular day, a young man came to talk to her about some criminal charges. And in those circumstances, she said, look, minor offences, I think I can get you off with good behaviour, no problem. He said, no, there is a problem. And the problem is, I want you to get me sent to jail for as long as possible. Can you do that? She explained, well, that's not really my role. My role is the exact opposite of that, to keep you out of jail. What's the situation? What he disclosed was that his father hadn't been on the scene for many years, that his mother had repartnered, and his mother's partner was quite violent. As a result, he was sleeping in the drain out the back most nights because it was safer for him to do so than to sleep inside the house. That young man had deliberately engaged in petty crime to get himself arrested and sent to juvenile justice because it was safer for him than to go home. The other example I've given you there is a very impressive young lady who now works with victims of domestic violence. She grew up watching her dad beat her mum, and that continued on a fairly regular basis until such time as her dad turned on her and her mum decided that enough was enough. But for that little girl, she grew up into a lovely young lady, but I don't think she ever forgot about it. So against the background of those sorts of scenarios and those stories, how do you think those people would react to the phrase, God loves us like a dad? Because neither of them really have experienced the sort of dad that we would want God to be referred to as. What do you do about talking to people about Jesus the bridegroom and the way he cares for the church to a woman who has been traumatised by domestic violence? It is not the picture of the bridegroom that we want to be sending. What is the message that she will have received out of that? So very briefly, when a relationship comes to an end, there is a grieving cycle, there are practical arrangements that need to be made in terms of where people are going to live, how they're going to feed themselves, what time kids are going to have, how they're going to organise things generally. It's really important for people to have independent legal advice early at that point. I know that it's counterintuitive and that we try and get away from having lawyers as far as we can. But the truth is that having good legal advice early can really help people to cut through the issues really quickly and not to end up in court if it's completely unnecessary. What I'd like to remind you is that when a domestic violence relationship comes to an end and separations occur, a victim of domestic violence will often leave and reconcile a number of times before they actually leave on the final basis. The average last time I checked the statistics is that they will leave or attempt to leave and reconcile 9 times before they finally manage to make a break. The other thing you need to remember is that leaving is the single most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence. The second most dangerous time is about 12 months after the initial separation. And that's usually when people are starting to think about divorcing their spouse. The reason it's most dangerous is because in a DV situation, the DV perpetrator loses control. And at the end of the day, it's about control. Those 2 times are where lines get drawn in the sand to say your behaviour has not been appropriate and it stops now. And when that happens and people lose control, they become very, very dangerous. Safety is incredibly important. Please don't underestimate how much danger a woman leaving a domestic violence relationship might be in. Okay, so in terms of what is domestic violence, I'm going to hand over to the lovely Eustacia, who's managing his team at the moment, for her to talk about that.
Thanks, Fiona. I'm actually quite privileged to be able to present this slide. I think it's important to remember that when we talk about domestic and family violence, we're not just talking about physical or sexual abuse. They are obvious examples, but it's actually defined as law as something much broader than that. Now, these definitions are not the result of soft-hearted or soft-minded family lawyers or social workers. This is what's enshrined. Is that better? Can people hear me now? If you can hear me, would you indicate, please? Okay, great. So just to take a step back, I was just saying I'm pleased to be able to present this slide because I think it's important, particularly as ministers, that people are aware of what is the legal definition of domestic violence and to have an in-depth understanding that it constitutes far more than just physical or sexual abuse. I think there have been a general social understanding throughout the years that physical and sexual abuse is not to be tolerated and this is not okay, but that any other sort of controlling behaviour can be put down to personality or culture or one of those things. But I want to be able to just inform you now about what law is definition of domestic violence is contained in a number of places, and Fiona and I deal routinely with the Family Law Act and the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act, which sets out in a fair bit of detail what domestic violence actually is. It is physical or sexual abuse. No examples are needed there. I think we can all understand what that means. Domestic violence is emotional or psychological abuse. This one's a bit of a tricky one, and not just because it is often, I guess, a result of the, I'm just going to pause again, the volume is going up and down. If at any time you can't hear me, please indicate by typing straight away. I'll just press on until I hear otherwise from the participants. Emotional or psychological abuse is one of those tricky ones where we all know that people get caught up in the heat of the moment and say unfortunate things. And I think there's a fear and perhaps a reluctance to delve into the complexity of this particular type of violence because no one's perfect, and we all say things that we don't mean. But we're not talking about a one-off instance or a momentary lapse. We're talking about a routine treatment of someone that is controlling or summarising of their character. It's basically just, we are having some technical difficulties, which is causing me to lose my train of thought. Let me give you some examples anyway, which might serve the purpose. Emotional or psychological abuse that I've seen in clients who've been told routinely, daily, you're so unattractive, you do nothing to make yourself attractive to me, you're so sensitive all of the time, routine name calling, that kind of thing. Anything that basically summarises their character as something less than worthy of respect. Economic abuse. Now, we often see this manifest in situations where one party, usually the wife, doesn't have access to finances. Perhaps all the property is in the husband's name or the domestic partner's name. Perhaps she doesn't have access to her own funds. It often looks like having to account for every single cent that is spent, where there's no trust or mutual respect between the spouses about how and when money is spent. Only one set of values is taken into account when it comes to spending money. And it often takes the guise of protection. Often the husband will say things like, I know better, or she will say, he just wants to protect me. Now, again, it can be difficult to sort of tease apart the nuances of different relationships and the cultural overlays, but it is important to know that at the heart of all of these types of abuse is a lack of respect and a desire to control. And I think if we can see it in that framework, that helps us categorise the behaviours that we're coming up against. Domestic violence is threatening or coercive behaviour. For example, threatening to tell someone about something private. It's not uncommon for victims of domestic violence to hear things from their husband such as, well, if you do that, I'm going to go and tell the pastor, or I'm going to go and tell your home group leader, or I'm going to go and tell your parents. And there's a lot of shame and so forth that's associated with being on the receiving end of violence. So that is often an effective method of controlling the spouse's behaviour. Damaging property. People are often surprised to learn that things like putting holes in the wall, slamming doors into walls, smashing phones, are not just displays of passion, but they are in fact an act of domestic violence. Threatening suicide or self-harm, and essentially any behaviour that is controlling or dominating and causes that person to fear for their safety or well-being. And this would include things like online surveillance, checking their emails without their knowledge, always picking a fight the night before an important event, always disrupting family events, coming to their workplace I can think of an example which occurred just recently within a church situation where the husband wasn't very happy that the wife was working outside the home, and whenever she goes to work, she'll routinely receive 10 to 20 text messages from him in those few hours that she's at work, saying that he can't cope and that she needs to come home. It can look like not providing money for medication. It can look like threatening to hurt the family pet. I think Fiona will touch on that a bit down the track. So there are just some examples of how it manifests. And I'm going to hand back over to Fee now to talk about why it's important that we deal with it.
So this year for White Ribbon Day, I had a bit of a think about it, and for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, I went with the alliteration road. So domestic violence is damaging to our community. It's debilitating to the victims and witnesses of domestic violence. It's deadly to the victims, and it is devastating in its impact upon kids. It has very wide-reaching implications and effects, and I just want to run through some statistics. If a woman has been subjected to physical abuse at any point in their current relationship, they are 7 times more likely than the usual average to have a severe psychological issue. That jumps to 21 times more likely if that physical abuse was during the last 12 months. If there was sexual abuse within the relationship at any point, it's 17 times more likely than the state average to have severe psychological issues. People who experience domestic violence also generally experience massive effects on their physical health. There are significant effects on their ability to hold down a job and on their spiritual health. In terms of how damaging to our community, financially, PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that the annual cost of violence against women costs Australia $21.7 billion. They estimate that on the current trajectory, over the next 30 years, it will cost Australians $323.4 billion. I don't know about you, but I'm fairly certain I could find better things to spend money on. The costs include things like health costs, both initial physical violence and long-term costs of treating depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. It includes lost productivity at work, which is being borne by employers all around Australia through absenteeism, being late or having to attend court, or just not being present because the issues that they have at home are just pressing down on them. It includes consumption costs. So domestic violence victims regularly have to replace items that are damaged during DV incidents. The most common one is mobile phones. Often they have to refurnish houses when they choose to leave a relationship. Sometimes things are damaged and can't be have to be replaced. Sometimes they can't be. They have medical costs associated with caring for children who witness domestic violence around counselling. There are costs of caring for children who are taken into the care of the department and the work required to work with the family towards reunification. There are costs in running a legal and criminal system, including running courts, police services and prisons. Prisons are not cheap. I'm fairly certain that you probably have some knowledge of that, but they are expensive to run. Funerals are not terribly cheap either, last time I checked. There are additional school services that are incurred. A lot of kids who grow up witnessing domestic violence are also in a position where their school is more difficult than for other kids, and that the school needs to provide further support services to make sure that they have the ability to keep up with their peers. The cost of security upgrades for houses and businesses. In terms of how debilitating, research by Victorian Health has found that domestic violence is the leading contributor to death, disability and illness in Victorian women aged 15 to 44 years, higher than blood pressure, smoking or obesity. Quite apart from the physical injuries and chronic pain and mental health issues, domestic violence has been linked to significant levels of acquired brain injuries, and nearly 18% of all depression experienced by women in Australia is related directly to domestic violence. In terms of how deadly domestic violence is in our community, the numbers are fairly horrific. We hear numbers bandied around about 50 or on average a woman dying each week in Australia. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that that number is not accurate and hasn't been accurate for some time. In 2014, we had 95 domestic violence related deaths in Australia. 2015, that had jumped to 158. 2016, we had 176. In 2017, we had 201 DV deaths in Australia. If you want to check the data, feel free, but just make sure that you have a really close look at how they calculate that data. In 2017, they did change it and they presented it differently, splitting the numbers into homicide and murder rather than keeping it in one category. So far this year that I know of, we've had 57 women die as a result of DV homicides, and that doesn't include their children, and that figure continues to climb. It's not uncommon, unfortunately, for us to have familicide incidents in Australia. For those not familiar with that term, familicide is the term that is given to when someone kills their children and their spouse and then turns the gun on themselves generally, or something similar. In terms of those sorts of incidents, we certainly have seen some very high profile ones, for example, in Western Australia over the last couple of months. And unfortunately, when you look at the DV related death category, a number of those are children. You do need to be aware when you're looking at particularly the sex of the victims. There was someone said to me recently, oh, but it's not that dissimilar between men and women. You know, it's 60-40 type arrangement now. And I had to say yes, but that includes the fact that there's a whole lot of male children who have been murdered by their parent in a familicide attempt. So just be careful of the statistics. Make sure you question them and look at how they've been calculated. Last year, a third of all sexual assaults reported to police were DV related. And for those who think it's about guns, please think again. 2/3 of homicides involved a weapon. Most commonly, that was a knife. 1/3 of those homicides were in circumstances where there was no weapon. So that means that someone went to the extent of killing their partner with their bare hands. The fact that someone could get to that point is just truly horrifying. For the most part, these sorts of domestic violence related deaths involving a weapon, it's something like, it hovers, and it has consistently been hovering for a number of years, around 7 or 8% involve 7 or 8% of the ones that involved a weapon involve a rifle or a gun of some sort. So it's a tiny percentage really of the total deaths, and really doesn't seem to be contributing. In terms of how devastating to our kids, recent neuroscience research is suggesting that kids that are exposed to or witness domestic violence have the same structural changes in their brains as kids who grow up in a war zone. So kids' brains, the way they are wired up, are actually changing when they are in trauma situations, and it's not changing for the better. Chronic and toxic stress in kids, we know, causes problems in respect of their brain formation. That extends to babies and young infants who are pre-verbal. A lot of people historically have gone, well, it's just a baby, the baby won't know the difference. Well, the research says very clearly that even babies who are exposed to abuse and neglect are affected, that their brain formation is affected, and they are far more likely to experience insecure or disorganised attachment issues. And as a result of that, they generally have severe effects on kids' ability to learn to communicate and interact appropriately with other people, and their ability to form healthy relationships. I would be intrigued to see what research has been done, and I suspect it probably hasn't progressed this far yet, but I hope it will at some point, in terms of the number of people or number of adults who have significant impairments in terms of their ability to form and maintain healthy relationships and what their family of origin looks like. Because the unhappy scenario that we are dealing with as a community is that we know that domestic violence is on the rise, has been on the rise for a long time. And against that background, we've got kids across Australia who have been growing up in these toxic scenarios who probably have a range of issues that have not even been identified at this point. I want to particularly draw your attention to this particular quote. It is one that I've gone back to a number of times over the years, and it came up in a ICL matter that I was dealing with where I acted for the child effectively. And what it said is that research over the last 20 years has unequivocally determined that children who are exposed to violence in the home suffer a wide range of poor psychosocial and health outcomes. The literature indicates that exposure to domestic and family violence in childhood is associated with depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, aggression, lower social competence, low self-esteem, fear and loneliness. Children exposed to domestic and family violence in childhood may also have poorer academic outcomes, higher rates of peer conflict and impaired cognitive functioning. Health and socio-economic impacts include high likelihood of future alcohol and drug abuse, depression, unemployment and homelessness. The other thing I'd like to point out, and this has come really as a result of other work that I do with schools coming out of the Royal Commission, and that is, in one study, 95% of kids who had sexually assaulted another child were found to have experienced or witnessed a domestic violence incident. So domestic violence was seen to be a contributing factor of kids engaging in sexual violence against each other. I don't think that that figure is an accident. And as we see rising domestic violence in our communities, we're going to probably see continuing issues with these sorts of social problems. In terms of ministry, why does it matter? I've already mentioned about talking about Jesus the bridegroom with a victim of domestic violence, and about God the Father with a child who is beaten senseless by their dad regularly. How do we expect them to actually understand what we're trying to communicate in those word pictures? Domestic violence matters in ministry because we are called to bind up the broken, to liberate the captives and to care for the widows. In Ezekiel 34, there's a scathing judgment on the shepherds of Israel who eat the fat and clothe themselves with the wool of the flock, but they fail to strengthen the diseased, heal the sick, bind up the broken and seek the lost. Jesus models that course of action himself, and we would seek to do what Jesus does. There is no one more broken than someone who has experienced the pain of being the victim of domestic violence or has watched their parents engage in domestic violence. In Isaiah 61, the writer says that the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. The practical reality is that victims of domestic violence, generally speaking, are victims of control. They are in a prison of their own relationship. They are unable to leave. And that's really borne out by the number of times that people try and leave before they do so successfully.
If I just may add a comment there, it's not unusual for them to say it was harder to leave than it was to stay.
Yeah, exactly. A few more thoughts. Domestic violence is one of Australia's leading criminal health and wellbeing issues. There was a recent, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, there was a article in the ABC
where Magistrate Baldwin, who sits in Gympie, I think from memory, told a man that he would have to have been living under a rock not to know that Australia was very serious about domestic violence. That particular man there were some cultural overtones, but he had clearly lived in Australia for long enough to know better. And Magistrate Baldwin was very clear about saying, this is not okay. Most people in your congregation will experience domestic violence, be exposed to domestic violence, or know someone who's going through it.
I just had a comment there. It's not unusual in our experience for pastors and ministers to really honestly express their revulsion of violence, and that's to be commended. I guess what concerns us is that an expression of revulsion about it doesn't actually guarantee its absence in the church. And I'm just going to read a quote. You might have the most winsome and compelling articulation of God's design for marriage and for healthy relationships. And the statistics tell us that there's still likely to be abuse in the church.
Sorry, I'm just going to interject at this point. Are you able to hear us now? Can you just type in and give us an indication?
Okay, can you hear us again?
Okay. I was just making the comment that it's not unusual in our experience for pastors to articulate a position, if you like, on domestic violence, even from the pulpit, and perhaps preach an amazing sermon, the best that's ever been preached, on the topic of domestic violence and how it is unacceptable. And,
hi, sorry to interrupt. It's Daniel from Redback Cotton here. It's when the current speaker is speaking that we can't really hear the audio. Everybody else in the room seems to be okay. It's this particular lady. Is there a way we can get the mic closer to her at all?
yes.
Okay, I'm now leaning over really close. Is that better?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Sorry.
Thanks, Daniel.
Okay, just to backtrack slightly. We can do that?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. I'm getting very close now, so hopefully you can all hear me. I was just saying that it's not uncommon in our experience for pastors to articulate a position either from the pulpit or privately with their members of the congregation, which essentially says we don't accept violence in our church. They might preach a very winsome and compelling sermon, perhaps, on God's design for marriage and for healthy relationships, and yet the statistics tell us that there is still likely to be abuse in your church. And I guess I just wanted to encourage pastors to not take the position that, well, you know, we've established a position and we don't know that it's occurring, so things are not as bad as they are. The statistics tell us otherwise. And so I just want to encourage you not to be tempted into thinking that things are perhaps better than they seem.
I would certainly echo that, and I think the other thing to say is that what we do know about domestic violence is it is statistically underreported. So on average, we think at least 50% of victims never report that they are the victim of domestic violence. I'm astounded by the number of people who have come to me at church and have said, can I talk to you? I'd like to tell you what's happening. And they'll tell me, but they will never have told the pastoral team. So although people might not be telling you what's going on, I think you should probably assume that it is happening. We're specifically called to bind up the broken and liberate the captives, and church leaders are very uniquely positioned to respond helpfully in those circumstances. Church leaders are also uniquely positioned to do significant harm if they don't deal with it or they deal with it poorly. Sin, and in this case abuse, thrives in conditions of silence. what we know is that people who do report, often to pastors, if they do not get a useful response the first time, will often never report it again. Consider that God frequently throughout the Bible condemns oppression. He condemns the burdening of people by abuse of power or position and the use of violence. God doesn't use power the same way. Jesus manifested humility and gentleness and self-sacrificing for others, and it's proper that we embrace justice and mercy. And I would call you to consider your responsibility to live under the laws of Australia and to encourage others to do the same. So this is the domestic violence cycle that we wish that you knew. And it's important in terms of the counselling that you do in your churches. The cycle of violence has really been around for many, many years, and it's very well respected in terms of and supported in terms of research. What generally happens in a DV scenario is that there's an explosion. There's then a phase where people are remorseful, that they're sorry, they'll never do it again. They seek forgiveness. They then pursue the other person. It's, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again. And it becomes a honeymoon phase. So there's flowers and chocolates and gifts and notes and all sorts of things before it moves into what we would call a build-up phase, where things are starting to get tense and people are walking on eggshells at home. We then get into standover phase before there's another explosion. This cycle could take months and months, or it could be within a day. And the issue is that the longer it goes on, the quicker the cycle tends to be. Once the cycle is fairly short, I start getting concerned if it's less than a month. But once we're getting into the week type territory, we're dealing with an incredibly dangerous situation. The difficulty in a ministry scenario is how to tell the difference between what is genuine remorse and repentance from a Christian point of view and the remorse and pursuit phase of a domestic violence cycle. What does that even look like? I can honestly say to you, after working in this space for 14 years, I actually can't tell the difference half the time. And so I would urge you to seriously consider dealing with everything as if it's not genuine remorse and repentance so much as the next stage in the DV cycle. I know that's very harsh, but the truth is that the life of someone might depend on you getting that right. And I'd rather people err on the side of caution. It doesn't mean that we stop caring for the person who has allegedly perpetrated domestic violence, but it does mean that we act protectively, as if we believe the victim first up.
Can I throw in another? Read recently that false reporting of incidents of domestic violence. So most of the time, people need to be believed.
I want to talk a little bit about why people don't leave if it's so bad, because there's this really, okay, bear with us a second. Okay, have we got sound again?
Can you hear us now? Okay.
Okay, all right. We'll keep going. Thank you for bearing with us. One of the difficulties is people often say to me, oh, well, if it was really that bad, they'd leave. And the short version is I want to tackle that because it's a dreadful, dreadful scenario for people to actually believe that. The the reason people don't leave is they fear that they are not going to be believed. Particularly in a church scenario, it's really not very uncommon for people to say, but I couldn't say what happened because he's an elder of the church and no one would believe me. They feel embarrassed or ashamed that they are experiencing violence and that their relationship is breaking down, particularly in a church situation where people generally will want to say, well, marriage is forever. Often victims of domestic violence have lost their confidence. They find it hard to trust anyone and they find it incredibly difficult to back themselves. They have often heard that they're hopeless, that they're unable to manage money, that they're unable to care for the children, that their career is in tatters, that they're not capable people. And the difficulty is if you hear that from someone you love long enough, or someone you trust long enough, you come to believe it. People who have been in these scenarios often leave them with zero self-esteem and no self-belief. They may have had poor responses when they've spoken to people previously, and we know that often if people speak to someone and get a poor response, they usually won't try again. There's a significant fear in people sometimes of the offender minimising the incident to the police and others. I can tell you I've spent the morning inspecting subpoenaed material where that is exactly the situation. And everyone has been looking at it from the point of view of, oh, well, you know, it's actually not that bad. But when we've looked at it closely, it really is that bad, and it's probably worse than what we thought. People often fear that they will experience increased abuse and violence and physical restrictions. And the reality is, if people find out, if the perpetrator finds out that they are starting to make those steps, that is absolutely on the cards. They fear being left with no financial security or a home, or being left alone and isolated. They fear the shame of exposing the family to outside scrutiny. They often fear how the church family will react. And they're often told that the Bible says they should stay. Often people will go to counselling, they'll be told, well, he said that he wouldn't do it again, and because it's not going to go again, you know, he's remorseful, he's repented of his behaviour, and you should believe him and you should take him back. Well, you know what? That attitude could be the thing that costs someone their life. Some people will fear that if they separate, the risk will be even higher, and they're probably right. We have seen in Australia, unfortunately, two very articulate women who have been brave enough to speak up. You ask Rosie Batty or Anne O'Neill about the costs that they have endured. Anne O'Neill has particularly been in the media over the last month or so. Her husband shot and killed her children in front of her and then turned the gun on her. He shot her. She lost her leg as a result of an amputation, and then he killed himself. For someone who has experienced that level of trauma, that is just an example of what is happening all around Australia on a regular basis for people who try to leave domestic violence relationships. It's really critical that you comprehend and grasp and take to heart that we're not talking about a situation that's not going to happen in your church. For a long time, I have prayed and hoped that I never have to deal with a situation where my client is the one that is the victim of a murder-suicide. And believe me, there have been a few along the way that worry me. Okay, so we've given you some referral options. I know that Eustacia in particular has a referral option that she recommends in terms of a website that we talked about last time. I'm not sure whether it's on that list, but if it's not, I will, there we go, it's right on the back. So do have a look at that. In terms of roles and responsibilities, I've put them up in terms of the different people who have some responsibilities in this space. I'm going to skip over that for the moment because I'm sure that's not very surprising information to you. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer. But in terms of some suggested responses, the first is violence is never acceptable. It's criminal behaviour. It has no place in our homes and churches. It's probably much worse than is being reported to you if they're brave enough to talk to you at all. Perhaps the most vivid example of this was one of my matters where my client told me that he'd been hanging around, that he'd been threatening, that he'd raised his voice, those sorts of things. I walked into the mediation and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. He was charming. He held his hand out, we shook hands, he asked me how my day was. He was all smiley and happy to be there. I excused myself from the mediation and took my client with me, sat her in a room and said, "What have you not told me? There is something that is not sitting right." And it was at that point she told me that the domestic violence included him grabbing a machete, chasing her around the house, swinging it at her head, and that at times it had embedded into the wall next to her head. For every time that someone speaks up about the abuse that they are experiencing, there is likely to be at least one person who has experienced abuse in your community that is not saying anything at all. Domestic violence is massively underreported. Please, if you do get told about a situation, please refer them to someone who is skilled in this area. It's not too fine a point to say that their life may well depend on the referrals that you make. One of the things that I hate about my job is that there are some very practical things that I'd really like to do that I can't. I'm a lawyer, I give legal advice, and I do safety planning, and I do a variety of things. But you guys are uniquely placed. When someone comes and tells you that they are the victim of domestic violence, you have the option to say, are you safe? Do you need somewhere safe to stay? Do you want me to come and collect you and the children and the dog? One of the fascinating things to me is the number of people who refuse to leave a domestic violence relationship because part of the domestic violence has been threatening to harm or hurt the animals. And there would be a number of people who have simply refused to leave DV scenarios because they can't take the dog with them and they're convinced that he's going to kill the dog. It's important to be asking people whether they have a plan to keep safe and how you can help with that. It's important to listen and not to judge them. It's important that they know that this is not their fault and that this behaviour is not okay. Refer them to an appropriate service or source of information. Be cautious about advising victims of domestic violence about withdrawing applications or returning home because you could be sending someone home to die. The other thing I would say to you is this. There's a whole lot of information and resources available to victims of domestic violence. But one of the critical things is that we're seeing a lot more of is technology stalking. And one of the things that people are going to be looking at is the victim of domestic violence should assume that everything in their computer, every time they've accessed an internet site, for example, is going to be scrutinised by the other party. One of the really interesting things that churches can do very easily is make sure that people have access to a safe place to access the internet that is not scrutinised. You know, people are going to Bible studies, for example. There is an opportunity there for victims of domestic violence who can set up their own lines of communication. So separate email addresses, for example, Hotmail accounts, whatever, to be able to then communicate with the people that they need to be able to do safety planning, to look at internet resources that give them safety planning information. Those sorts of things are absolute gold to a victim of domestic violence.
I can give another example there of one lady who wanted to leave a situation and had been told that she should photocopy her important documents and store them off-site so that when the time came to leave, she would have access to all those important things like medical records, marriage certificate, children's information. Disclosed to one of her friends that she was preparing.
Okay, hang on a sec. We have no idea what's going on. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. We'll just run with me. Okay. Maybe I'm just the loudmouth of the two of us. All right. So the last thing I want to say is this is a particularly profound statement that Eustacia shared with me. And it comes, what it says is, when someone says, I don't want to take sides, or we must be careful to love both of you, it's not possible to be truly balanced in one's views of an abuser and an abused woman. As Judith Herman explains eloquently in her masterwork, Trauma and Recovery, neutrality actually serves the interest of the perpetrator much more than those of the victim, and it's not neutral. Although an abuser prefers to have you wholeheartedly on his side, he will settle contentedly for your decision to take a middle stance. To him, that means that you see the couple's problems as partly her fault and partly his fault, which means that it isn't abuse. The other thing I would add to that is it's really important to think through the church responses here, because I've seen churches in the past do things like say, well, he's an elder, so perhaps you should leave the congregation and go elsewhere. What that does is it means that for someone who has probably already been the victim of control and isolation, it means that they are further removed from any support network that they might have been able to access through the church. I know it's tempting to go, you know what, this is really too hard, you should both separate and go to different churches, but it's important that you don't do that, that you think through that scenario very carefully. The saferesource.org.au is one that Eustacia particularly recommends, and that was the one that I was saying to you earlier, you should double check. It's particularly for churches and for faith-based organisations, so have a look at it, it will help. Of course, you can always refer clients to us. Eustacia and her team will care for them very, very well. And if churches have specific issues and we don't act for either of the parties, we're happy to help in terms of providing advice as required as well. Our contact details are up there. What I'm going to do now is just leave it open for a couple of minutes in case people have questions that you'd like to ask, and we'll do our best with the sound issues.